A short while ago, I released a video discussing objects on the moon that appear illuminated on the shaded side. It's fair to say that that video ruffled some feathers, but this war is far from over. Propagandists love to claim that in photos such as these, objects are lit up on the shaded side not because of studio fill lights, but because of sunlight bouncing off the moon's surface. The claim takes full advantage of the common layman's mistake that the moon is very bright. I think astronaut Michael Collins said it best when he wrote on page 380 of his book, Carrying the Fire, "The moon doesn't appear to be getting much bigger, but the Earth is shrinking noticeably. As bedtime approaches, home scarcely fills the small window. What it lacks in size, however, it makes up in brightness. As more and more blackness becomes visible around it, the intensity of its reflected light seems to increase, at least by comparison. We humans are accustomed to watching the moon and thinking of it, when it's full at least, as being very bright. In scientific terms, however, it is a dullard. Its albedo is 7%, which means that it reflects only 7% of the sunlight that strikes its surface. The moon's albedo of 7% is exactly the same albedo of asphalt here on Earth. Taking full advantage of this fact, we decided to do a test of our own on an asphalt road at night. Using only the one light source, we were unable to get our LEGO astronaut to light up unless we considerably increased the exposure setting. In response, the propagandists dismissed my experiment as invalid, arguing that my car headlight was not bright enough. It soon became clear that no artificial light source would ever satisfy the propagandists, because as long as the experiment doesn't give them the results they want, they'll always dismiss it. In the past, the propagandists have provided us with one botched experiment after another in which they increase their chances of getting their desired results by using much brighter surfaces than the moon's. Finally, I realized there was only one light source that would truly be adequate: the sun. So enter Project Blackbox. Okay, previously we tried to do the experiment at night. We used a headlight, but propagandists, they just claimed that, oh, the headlight's not bright enough. Okay, so we used the street light. Still not bright enough, they said. Okay, so the only way I'm going to get a bright enough object to satisfy them is to use the actual sun. Okay, but of course there's a problem doing the experiment at daytime. You see, the sky is blue because we've got the sunlight being refracted through miles and miles of air molecules, and subsequently the sky is blue. Now, as long as an object is in line of sight with the blue sky itself will act as a secondary light source. Alright, what we're going to do here to overcome that obstacle is we've got this cardboard box here. One side of it is cut off, so we've got the sunlight shining through. The interior of the box is painted black, so there is no reflected light inside, and it's completely sealed off from any line of sight with the blue sky. So there is no blue sky shining down on this LEGO astronaut. I have a little hole cut in the back here, which I can stick my camera through, and I can see the astronaut inside. Because we're using the sun, and we're on an asphalt road which has the exact same albedo as the moon's surface, this is as close a simulation as you are ever going to get. And here is the first shot, taken using f4 and a 1/100th of a second shutter speed. Now, compared to the pictures we got at night, it does look better, I admit. However, it just doesn't seem to nail it. The LEGO astronaut appears partially illuminated, but compared to Aldrin, he looks quite dark. And look at the front of the LEGO lunar module, it's virtually black. Here's what the shadowed side of the LEM looked like on Apollo 11. As you can see, it's quite well lit up and looks nothing like our LEGO model. In order to get our LEGO to look as bright as the LEM and brighten up our astronaut, we would need to increase the shutter speed. But as you can see, by doing that, we greatly overexpose the asphalt and even the blue sky. In our experiment, as we did before, we took all these exposures at f4. Now, in this 1/100th of a second exposure, we can clearly see that the shadowed side of the astronaut is quite dark. In fact, even the shadowed side of the LEM itself is quite dark. if we were to increase the exposure setting, we would have greatly overexposed the landscape, which would have just made it just a wash of bright light. If you recall back to the 16mm reels from Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong was quite dark as he descended the lunar module, and in order to photograph Armstrong, they needed to open the aperture wider. But in doing so, they greatly overexposed the landscape. This never happened in any of the Hasselblad photography showing astronauts illuminated in shadow. So the only conclusion is, they were either using a secondary light source, a reflector, or maybe they were using something brighter than this asphalt we're sitting on. Now we're going to take off this box and see if being in line of sight with the sky makes any difference. And taking the shot. Yep. I'm not even going to bother taking a second shot because the results of that one shot is definitive. Okay? Because he was under the cardboard box, he was not in line of sight with the blue sky, and thus he appeared black. Now, if you were in space, that would be the same effect, because there is no atmosphere, there is no air to create this blue sky, which would act as a secondary light source. Anyways, we've just taken the shot without the box on top, and we can clearly see, even though we used the same 1/100th of a second shutter speed, now, because he has no box on top of him, he appears well lit up. There's another possibility, perhaps they were actually shooting this out in the open, and they had the bloody blue sky in line of shot. Maybe that's what happened. Either way, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt now that this was not filmed on the moon. Just for fun, why not let's do the experiment again, but this time on Portland cement, which is the same material that the Mythbusters used, and let's see what happened. Here is the resultant Portland cement shoot. As we learned previously, white Portland cement has a minimum albedo of 40%, which is about the same albedo as the Earth seen from space. Both the LEGO astronaut and the lunar module are lit up more than on asphalt, and are looking closer to what Buzz Aldrin looked like on the moon. Obviously, the Portland cement makes all the difference. It reflects significantly more light than the asphalt. And of course, the asphalt has the same albedo as the moon. If you can't get the astronauts to be lit up on this asphalt road underneath that box where there is no line of sight with the sky, then you're not going to get the astronauts to look as bright as Aldrin on the moon. Of course, looking at this photography in comparison to the video footage of the same experiment, the asphalt looks quite bright, much brighter than it appears on video or even with the naked eye. This is because we opened the aperture all the way up to f4. This enormously wide aperture setting subsequently allows a lot more light into the camera and subsequently makes the asphalt appear whiter, especially in bright sunlight. This enormous f-stop can also account for the partial illumination seen on our LEGO astronaut. So the propagandists could argue that Neil Armstrong used a wide aperture when taking this picture to make Aldrin appear so bright. But still, doing so would greatly overexpose the landscape. In our f4 1/100th of a second exposure, you can clearly see that the black asphalt is very white with brightness, and yet our astronaut is only partially illuminated. To widen the aperture to the point that Aldrin looked like this would ruin the shot. To correctly expose the landscape, we would need to close up the aperture to limit the amount of light shining into the camera. In playing around with these settings, we find that f11 is adequate enough to correctly expose the landscape, but in doing so, any partial illumination that our astronaut had at f4 is lost, and thus he appears black. If we take off the box and photograph the astronaut again, using the same f11 1/100th of a second exposure settings, we find that the shadowed side of the astronaut and LEM are now lit up, and are looking closer to what we see in the Apollo pictures. This is because the blue sky is acting as a natural fill light, and we have an exposure setting perfect for objects directly lit by the sun. Quite clearly, this photo was not taken on the moon. The lunar surface does not reflect enough light to illuminate the astronaut. And there is no such aperture or shutter speed settings that would create such an exposure. It would require a magic camera that can correctly expose the dark shaded objects and the comparatively bright surface at the same time.